Hey, old-timer, you lost? The soup kitchen is 2 blocks that way. The words cut through the warm air of the anchor's rest like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Bryce Whitmore stood with his chest out and his silver star gleaming under the amber lights. A half-empty glass of whiskey in one hand and contempt etched into every line of his clean-shaven face. The old man at the end of the bar did not flinch. He sat with his shoulders curved inward, a posture that spoke of years spent trying to take up less space in a world that had stopped making room for him. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, the fabric held together with strips of duct tape that had begun to yellow and peel. His beard was long and gray and unkempt, and his hands wrapped around a glass of water the bartender had slid to him without being asked. "Thank you for the direction, sir," the old man said. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, roughened by weather and disuse. "But if it is all the same to you, I will finish my water and be on my way." Whitmore laughed, the sound sharp and performative, designed to carry. He looked over his shoulder at the 2 younger SEALs who had followed him from the back room, where the reunion was in full swing. "You hear that? He called me sir. At least the vagrant has manners." The Anchor's Rest was not a place that welcomed strangers easily. Its walls were paneled in dark wood that had absorbed decades of cigarette smoke and hard stories. Challenge coins covered the surface of the bar in neat rows, each one a small monument to service and sacrifice. Behind the bottles of whiskey and bourbon, photographs lined the shelves. Men in desert camouflage, men on the decks of ships, men who had come home and men who had not. An American flag hung beside the entrance, flanked by the black POWMIA banner, its silhouette a reminder that some debts could never be fully paid. Tonight the bar was fuller than usual. The annual Special Operations Reunion had drawn active duty and retired operators from across the country. The back room overflowed with laughter and the particular energy of men who had seen the worst of the world and learned to joke about it. But now a few of them had drifted to the doorway, drawn by the commotion at the bar. The bartender, a young man with Army infantry tattoos climbing up both forearms, wiped the glass and watched the scene with visible discomfort. He had given the old man the water 20 minutes ago after watching him come in from the December cold, his thin frame shaking, his breath fogging in the doorway before he stepped inside. Something about the way the old man moved had caught the bartender's attention. There was a precision there, an economy of motion that seemed at odds with his appearance. But the bartender did not know what to make of it, and so he said nothing. Whitmore took a step closer. He was 34 years old and carried himself like a man who had never been told no. 3 deployments, a chest full of ribbons, the kind of confidence that came from always being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, or at least believing himself to be. "What's that around your neck, old-timer?" He gestured with his whiskey glass toward the chain visible at the collar of the old man's frayed shirt. "Let me guess. Dog tags you bought at the surplus store for $5. You one of those guys who likes to play dress-up?" The old man's hand moved slowly to the chain. His fingers were weathered, the knuckles swollen with age and old injuries. He lifted the tags free from his shirt and held them for a moment, looking at them rather than at Whitmore. They were worn smooth, the edges rounded by decades of contact with skin, the engravings faded but still legible to anyone who cared to look closely. "They are real, sir," the old man said. "Sure they are. Before we continue this story, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Leave a comment below telling us your city or country. Stories like this one about courage and sacrifice and second chances happen in communities everywhere. You might have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood, someone whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. If these stories speak to you, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Whitmore plucked the tags from the old man's hand before he could react, examining them under the light. He squinted at the information stamped into the metal. The format was old, the layout from an era before the wars that had defined Whitmore's own career. He turned them over, noting the scratches, the patina of age, what looked almost like dark stains in the grooves of the lettering. For a moment something flickered across his face. A hesitation. Then it was gone, replaced by the sneer that had become his default expression tonight. "Vintage," he said, tossing the tags back onto the bar in front of the old man. "I will give you that. Where did you steal these from? Some dead veteran's grave?" The old man picked up the tags carefully, almost reverently, and placed them back around his neck. He tucked them beneath his shirt where they rested against his chest. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, and he did not look at Whitmore as he performed this small ritual. "I did not steal them," he said. Whitmore leaned in closer. His breath smelled of expensive whiskey and aggression. "Then prove it. What unit did you serve with? What was your rate? Give me one piece of real information, and maybe I will not have you thrown out of here for stolen valor." The bar had grown quieter now. More of the reunion attendees had gathered at the doorway to the back room, drinks in hand, watching the confrontation unfold. Some of them wore expressions of amusement. Others looked uncomfortable. A few of the older ones, men with gray in their beards and decades of hard service behind their eyes, watched with something closer to attention. The old man took a slow breath. When he spoke, his voice was steady and soft. "Naval Special Warfare," he said. "Senior Chief." Whitmore's expression hardened. He straightened up and looked back at his companions with theatrical disbelief. "Naval Special Warfare," he repeated. "You expect me to believe that a homeless drunk was one of us?" He turned back to the old man, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "Let me tell you something. I have bled for that trident. I have buried friends who earned that trident. And watching some pathetic old fraud sit here, pretending to be something he is not, is an insult to every man who actually served." The old man said nothing. He simply lifted his glass of water and took a small sip, his hand steady, his eyes distant, focused on something far beyond the walls of the bar. But what Lieutenant Commander Whitmore did not know, what none of them could possibly know, was that in exactly 45 minutes his entire understanding of heroism would shatter against the truth standing in front of him. Because some men do not wear their service like a badge. Some men bury it so deep that only the ghost can find it. And the ghosts always remember. The old man set down his glass and waited for whatever came next. The water in his glass was still and clear, and the old man stared into it, as if he could see through to somewhere else entirely. The noise of the bar faded around him, the laughter from the back room becoming distant, the weight of Whitmore's contempt dissolving into something older and heavier. Memory has a way of pulling a man under when he stops fighting it, and Ezekiel Carver had stopped fighting a long time ago. He was 18 when he walked into the Navy recruiting office in Barstow, California. His father had called him a fool that morning, had told him that Carvers did not serve, that only men with nothing better to do signed their lives away to the government. Ezekiel had not argued. He had simply packed a single bag and left before dawn, walking 3 miles to the bus station with the sun coming up orange and heavy over the desert. Basic training had been easy. Too easy. The instructors noticed him within the first week, the way he moved, the way he processed information, the cold patience behind his eyes that most recruits did not develop until years into their service. They pulled him aside and asked if he had ever considered special warfare. He had not. He did not even know what it was. But he said yes, because saying yes was the only direction that led forward. Bud/S nearly killed him. Not physically, though there was plenty of that. The ocean at Coronado in winter. The sand that worked its way into every wound. The hours of punishment designed to break the mind before it broke the body. What nearly killed him was the isolation of it, the way the training stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself and left only the raw question of whether he would quit. He did not quit. He learned instead that there was something inside him that did not know how to stop, something that frightened him when he looked at it too closely. He earned his trident in 1976. He was 20 years old. The decades that followed blurred together in his memory now, a long corridor of deployments and operations and faces that came and went. Some of those faces he had trained. Some he had led. Some he had carried home in flag-draped boxes. He rose through the ranks, not because he sought advancement, but because the men above him kept recognizing something in him that he himself did not fully understand. Senior Chief by 40. Selection for Dev Group by 42. The missions that followed were the kind that did not exist in any official record, the kind that happened in places the maps did not name, against enemies the public would never know existed. They called him Reaper. He had not chosen the name. No one chose their call sign. It was given to him after an extraction in Colombia in 1989, a mission that had gone sideways in every possible way. He had been the only operator to walk out of the jungle, and he had walked out carrying a wounded CIA asset on his back and leaving behind 11 cartel soldiers who would never walk anywhere again. The name followed him after that, whispered in training facilities and planning rooms, spoken with a kind of reverence that made him uncomfortable. But none of that mattered now. None of it had mattered for 6 years. Colleen, her name surfaced in his mind like a body rising from deep water. He could see her face, the way she looked in the morning light that came through the kitchen window of their small house in Virginia Beach. She had been a nurse when they met, working the night shift at the Naval Hospital, and she had seen through him immediately. Seen through the silence and the distance and the walls he had built around himself. She had not tried to tear those walls down. She had simply walked around them as if they were not there, and somehow he had let her. 23 years of marriage. 23 years of her voice on the phone when he was deployed, her letters that smelled like the lavender she grew in the backyard, her arms around him when he woke from the nightmares he never spoke about. She was the anchor. She was the reason he came home. The morning he found her was a Tuesday in October. He had woken early, the way he always did, his internal clock still set to mission time even years after retirement. She was beside him in bed, and he had reached over to touch her shoulder the way he did every morning, a small ritual of reassurance that she was there, and he was there, and they had made it through another night. Her skin was cold. He did not remember calling the ambulance. He did not remember the paramedics arriving, or the questions they asked, or the words they used to explain what had happened. A brain aneurysm, they said. Sudden. Painless. She would not have known. As if that was supposed to be a comfort. As if anything could be a comfort when the only person who had ever made him feel human was gone between one heartbeat and the next. The funeral was small. He stood at the graveside in his dress blues and did not cry. He shook hands and accepted condolences and went home to a house that no longer felt like anything at all. For 3 weeks, he sat in the living room and did not eat and did not sleep and did not answer the phone when old teammates called to check on him. For 3 weeks, he stared at the photograph on the mantel, Colleen laughing on their wedding day, and felt the walls he had built so long ago begin to collapse inward. On the 22nd day, he wrote a note. He left it on the kitchen table beside his wallet and his keys and his wedding ring. The note said only that he was sorry, that he could not stay, that the house and everything in it should go to the veterans charity Colleen had always supported. Then he walked out the front door with nothing but the clothes on his back and the dog tags around his neck and the photograph of Colleen he had slipped into his pocket. He had not been back since. 6 years on the streets. 6 years of shelters and soup kitchens and corners of underpasses where the wind did not cut quite so deep. 6 years of becoming invisible, of learning that the world looked through men like him as if they were made of glass. He had wanted to disappear. He had wanted to become nothing, and he had almost succeeded. The sound of laughter pulled him back to the present. Whitmore was talking to his companions now, gesturing toward Ezekiel with theatrical disgust. The young lieutenant commander's voice carried across the bar, sharp and mocking. You see what I mean? These frauds are everywhere. They put on a sad face and flash some fake tags and expect us to feel sorry for them. It is an insult, an absolute insult. Ezekiel lifted his glass of water and took another small sip. His hand did not tremble. His expression did not change. The memories settled back into the darkness where he kept them, and he returned to the simple task of being no one at all. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. And in this bar, surrounded by men who had served and men who were serving still, the ghosts were stirring. They remembered what he had tried so hard to forget. And before the night was over, they would make themselves known. Whitmore was not finished. Men like him never were. The laughter from his companions had fed something in him, a hunger for dominance that demanded more. He turned away from the two younger SEALs and walked back toward the end of the bar where Ezekiel sat, his footsteps deliberate, his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from never having it challenged. The crowd at the doorway to the back room had grown. A dozen men now stood watching, drinks in hand, their conversations abandoned. Some of them wore the quiet confidence of active duty operators. Others carried the weathered calm of retirement, men who had seen enough to know that not everything was as it appeared. But none of them spoke. They simply watched, waiting to see how this would unfold. "All right," Whitmore said, planting himself directly in front of Ezekiel. He set his whiskey glass on the bar with a sharp click. "You said Naval Special Warfare. You said Senior Chief. So let us hear it. What was your BUD/S class? What teams did you serve with? Give me something real, or admit you are a liar, and get out of this bar before I have you arrested for stolen valor." Ezekiel did not look up immediately. His eyes remained fixed on his glass of water, on the small ripples that moved across its surface when someone walked past. When he finally raised his head, his expression was unchanged. Calm, patient, the face of a man who had long ago learned that words were weapons best used sparingly. "Class 89, he said. Winter 1975. Graduated February 1976. Whitmore snorted. "Class 89. That would make you what, 70 years old?" 71, Ezekiel said. The lieutenant commander shook his head, looking back at his audience with exaggerated disbelief. 71 years old, and he expects us to believe he was a SEAL. He turned back to Ezekiel. "What teams? Come on, old-timer. Keep the story going. This is entertaining." "Team 2 out of Little Creek," Ezekiel said. 1976 to 1984. Then Team 6. The words hung in the air for a moment. Team 6. SEAL Team 6. The name that had become legend, that had been plastered across headlines and movie posters and the covers of books written by men who had never set foot in Virginia Beach. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Team 6, he repeated. "You were telling me you were DevGru." Ezekiel did not respond. He simply looked at Whitmore with those pale blue eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. One of the younger SEALs behind Whitmore laughed nervously. "Come on, sir. This guy is clearly making it up. Team 6? Look at him." Whitmore held up a hand to silence the younger man. His jaw had tightened. Something about the old man's calm was getting under his skin, burrowing into the part of him that needed to be right, that needed to win. "If you were DevGru," he said slowly, "then you would have a trident tattoo. Every operator who made it through selection gets inked. It is tradition." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something between a challenge and a threat. "Roll up your sleeve. Show me the trident. Or admit you are full of it." The bartender had stopped wiping glasses. His hands rested flat on the bar, his eyes moving between Whitmore and the old man. He had served 4 years in the Army, 2 of them in Afghanistan, and he knew what real operators looked like. They did not always look like the lieutenant commander with his pressed shirt and his polished medals. Sometimes they looked broken. Sometimes they looked like men the world had chewed up and spit out. Sometimes they looked like the old man sitting at the end of his bar. Ezekiel considered the demand. His right hand moved slowly to the cuff of his left sleeve, fingers resting on the frayed fabric. The jacket was too big for him, donated from some church bin years ago, and the sleeves hung past his wrists. He did not roll the fabric up. Not yet. Instead, he looked past Whitmore to the doorway, where the older veterans stood watching. One of them had stepped forward. He was perhaps 60 years old, with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that had seen things they would never speak about. He wore a faded T-shirt with a Trident logo, so worn it was barely visible. His name was Master Chief Solomon Vance, retired, and he had been watching the confrontation with growing unease. There was something about the old man, something in the way he held himself, even while appearing to fold inward. The positioning of his feet, the angle of his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision without ever seeming to move. These are not things a civilian learned. These were not things that could be faked. They were the residue of decades of training, muscle memory, so deep it had become part of the bone. Vance moved closer, drawn by instinct more than curiosity. He studied the old man's face, trying to see past the beard and the weathering and the years. There was something familiar there, something dancing at the edge of recognition. "Hold on," Vance said quietly. His voice cut through the tension, drawing Whitmore's attention. The lieutenant commander turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Stay out of this, Master Chief. This is between me and the fraud." Vance ignored him. He was looking at Ezekiel now, looking at him with an intensity that seemed to strip away the years. He asked a question, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "What was your rate before they changed the designations? Before they made everyone special warfare operators?" Ezekiel met his eyes. For a moment, something passed between them, a recognition that existed below the level of words. "Quartermaster," Ezekiel said, then bosun's mate. "The old ratings. Before your time." Vance's face went pale. His hand reached out and gripped the edge of the bar as if he needed it to stay upright. The old ratings. QM and BM. The designations that had been phased out decades ago, that only the oldest generation of SEALs would remember, that only someone who had actually served in that era would know. Jesus, Vance vispirит. He stared at Ezekiel as if seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" The bar had gone completely silent. Even Whitmore had stopped talking, caught off guard by the change in the older veteran's demeanor. Every eye was fixed on the old man at the end of the bar, on this homeless stranger who had walked in from the cold and was now the center of something none of them fully understood. Ezekiel looked at Vance for a long moment. Then he looked down at his sleeve, at his hand still resting on the frayed cuff. The answer to who he was lay beneath that fabric. The answer to everything lay there, written in ink and scar tissue, a history that he had spent 6 years trying to bury. His fingers tightened on the cloth. The decision balanced on a knife's edge. The question hung in the air unanswered, and in that silence Ezekiel felt the years pulling at him again. Vance was still staring, still waiting, but Ezekiel was no longer entirely in the bar. He was somewhere else, somewhere the maps had stopped naming decades ago, somewhere the sand was red with more than iron oxide. Kandahar Province, September 2001, 3 weeks after the towers fell. The mission had not existed on paper. None of the early operations did. They were ghosts hunting ghosts, moving through a country that was about to become the center of the world attention, but had not yet felt the full weight of American fury. Ezekiel had been 50 years old and still operating, still leading teams into the dark because no one else had his experience, his instincts, his ability to read terrain and men with equal precision. But this mission was different. This one he took alone. A CIA asset had been embedded with a Taliban cell for 18 months, feeding intelligence back through channels so classified that fewer than a dozen people in the entire government knew he existed. His cover had been blown. The extraction window was 4 hours. The nearest team was 6 hours out. Someone had to go in solo, or the asset would be dead before dawn. Ezekiel had not hesitated. He never did. The compound was in a valley northwest of Kandahar City, surrounded by poppy fields and guarded by men who had been fighting invaders since before Ezekiel was born. He moved through the darkness like smoke, like something that was not entirely human. The night vision turned the world green and granular, and he processed each shadow, each movement, each sound with the cold calculation a machine built for one purpose. 31 men stood between him and the asset. 31 men with AK-47s and RPGs and the home field advantage of knowing every rock and ridge in that valley. He killed them all. Not quickly, not cleanly. War was never clean. It was methodical and brutal and necessary. And by the time he reached the room where they were holding the asset, his rifle was hot in his hands, and his body had taken 2 rounds, one in the shoulder and one through the meat of his left thigh. He did not feel them. He would not feel them for another 8 hours. Not until he had carried the asset 4 kilometers to the extraction point and watched the helicopter lift off into the gray morning light. "Mission complete, sir." Those were the only words he spoke when they pulled him aboard. Then he had closed his eyes and let the medics do their work. The Silver Star came 3 months later, presented in a ceremony that did not officially happen for an operation that did not officially exist. He had worn the medal once for the photograph that went into his classified file, and then he had put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. Medals were for the living. They did not bring back the dead. They did not erase the faces of 31 men who had family somewhere, who had been someone's sons and brothers and fathers. They did not quiet the part of him that wondered if there had been another way. But it was not Kandahar that haunted him most. It was not the 31. It was one, Tobias Mackenzie. Mac, the best point man Ezekiel had ever trained, a kid from Detroit who had shown up to BUD/S with nothing but a chip on his shoulder and an inability to quit. Ezekiel had recognized something in him immediately, the same cold patience that the instructors had seen in Ezekiel himself all those years ago. He had taken Mac under his wing, had trained him, had watched him grow into one of the finest operators in the community. They had been brothers, not by blood, but by something stronger, by the shared knowledge of what it meant to walk into the dark and trust that the man beside you would walk back out with you or die trying. Kinner Province, March 2003. Ezekiel's last deployment before retirement. The compound they were clearing had been flagged as low threat. Intelligence suggested a weapons cache, maybe a few local fighters, nothing that a team of their caliber could not handle in their sleep. Mac had taken point because Mac always took point. It was where he belonged. It was where he was best. The IED had been buried in the doorway, wired to a pressure plate so sensitive that even Mac's careful footsteps had been enough to trigger it. Ezekiel had been 3 steps behind him. He had seen the flash before he heard the sound, had felt the pressure wave lift him off his feet and slam him into the wall behind him. When he opened his eyes, Mac was 15 feet away, crumpled against the rubble like a puppet with cut strings. Ezekiel had crawled to him. His own ears were ringing, his vision swimming, blood running down his face from somewhere he could not identify. None of that mattered. Mac was still breathing. Mac was still alive. Ezekiel pulled him into his lap and pressed his hands against the wounds and screamed for a medic, even though he knew, somewhere beneath the desperation, that there was nothing anyone could do. The shrapnel had torn through Mac's abdomen and chest. The bleeding was everywhere, unstoppable, a tide that no amount of pressure could hold back. Mac's eyes found Ezekiel's face, and despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the knowledge of what was coming, he smiled. Not your fault, Reaper. His voice was barely a whisper, wet with blood. Never your fault. Tell my sister I kept my promise. Then he was gone. Ezekiel had carried him to the helicopter. He had carried him all the way back to base. He had stood at the memorial service and said words that he did not remember, and then he had packed his gear and filed his retirement papers and walked away from everything he had ever known. Because Mac had been 3 steps ahead of him. Because if Ezekiel had been on point that day, it would have been his foot on the pressure plate. Because he had spent every day since then wondering why he was still alive when Mac was not. The second set of dog tags around his neck were not his own. They were Mac's. He had carried them for 20 years now, a weight that never grew lighter. In the bar, Vance was still waiting for an answer. Whitmore was still watching with narrowed eyes. The crowd at the doorway had grown even larger, drawn by the strange energy that had settled over the room. Ezekiel blinked, and the memories receded. He was here. He was now. And the question of who he was could no longer be avoided. His fingers began to roll up his sleeve. The sleeve moved slowly up his forearm, the fabric resisting as if it too understood what was about to be revealed. But before the first inch of skin became visible, Whitmore stepped forward and grabbed Ezekiel's wrist. "That is enough," the lieutenant commander said. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into the tendons beneath the old man's weathered skin. "I have had enough of this charade. You're not rolling up your sleeve to show us some prison tattoo you got in counter lockup. You are leaving. Now." The bar seemed to contract around them. The air grew dense with the particular tension that precedes violence, that electric stillness when every person in a room recognizes that something is about to break. The younger SEALs behind Whitmore shifted their weight, uncertain whether to intervene or watch. The veterans at the doorway had gone rigid, their drinks forgotten in their hands. Vance took a step closer. "Lieutenant Commander," he said carefully, "maybe we should let him finish." "Stay out of this, Master Chief." Whitmore did not turn around. His eyes were locked on Ezekiel's face, searching for any sign of fear or submission. "This is my call. I am the ranking officer here, and I'm telling you this man is a fraud. Look at him. He is homeless. He is filthy. He probably has not held a weapon in his life, except to pawn one for drug money." Ezekiel did not try to pull his arm free. He did not struggle or protest. He simply looked at Whitmore's hand on his wrist, then raised his eyes to meet the younger man's gaze. There was no anger in his expression, no defiance, only a vast and terrible patience, the kind that comes from having endured things that most men could not imagine. "You are hurting my arm, son," he said quietly. "Good." Whitmore tightened his grip. "Maybe that will convince you to stop wasting our time with your pathetic little act." The bartender had come around from behind the bar now. He stood a few feet away, his hands open at his sides, his body positioned to intervene if necessary. He had seen bar fights before. He had seen men push past their breaking points. But something about this felt different. Something about the old man's stillness felt like the calm before a storm that had been building for decades. "Sir," the bartender said, addressing Whitmore, "maybe we should all just take a breath here. Let the man go and we can sort this out without anyone getting hurt." Whitmore laughed. "Hurt? You think this old drunk is going to hurt someone?" He looked back at his companions, inviting them to share in the joke. "This guy could not hurt a fly. He is probably too weak to even lift a rifle anymore." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Ripples spread outward, touching every person in the room. Some of the older veterans exchanged glances. They had seen this before, this arrogance, this certainty that came from youth and strength and never having been truly tested. They knew how dangerous it was. They knew how quickly it could shatter. Vance spoke again, his voice harder now. "Lieutenant Commander Whitmore, I am asking you to release that man's arm, and I am telling you to mind your own business." Whitmore's jaw was set, his pride fully committed now. He could not back down without losing face. He could not release Ezekiel without admitting that he might have been wrong. The trap was of his own making, and he could not see his way out of it. Ezekiel remained motionless. His breathing was slow and even. His pulse, had anyone bothered to check it, would have been as steady as a metronome. This was not the first time a younger man had put hands on him. On the streets, it happened with regularity. The drunk college kids who thought it was funny to shove a homeless man. The security guards who grabbed him by the collar and threw him out of doorways. The police officers who twisted his arms behind his back while cuffing him for the crime of sleeping in the wrong place. He had learned to endure. He had learned to wait. He had learned that resistance only made things worse, and that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. So he stood there and let Whitmore hold his wrist and let the seconds stretch into what felt like hours. But something was different tonight. Something had shifted when Vance asked about the old ratings. Something had cracked open inside him when the memories of Mac came flooding back. For 6 years, he had been trying to disappear, trying to become no one, trying to punish himself for sins both real and imagined. For 6 years, he had accepted every humiliation, every insult, every degradation as his due. Now, in this bar surrounded by men who wore the same trident he had bled for, something ancient stirred in his chest. Not anger, not pride, something deeper, something that remembered what it meant to stand for something, to be part of something larger than himself, to refuse to let the sacrifice of men like Mac be reduced to nothing. Whitmore must have seen it. Some flicker in the old man's eyes, some subtle change in his posture. The lieutenant commander's grip loosened just slightly, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. "What?" he said. "What are you looking at?" Ezekiel did not answer. Instead, with his free hand, he reached up and pulled the chain from around his neck. The dog tags emerged from beneath his shirt, both sets, his own and Mac's. He held them up so Whitmore could see them clearly. "You want to know who I am?" he said. His voice was still quiet, but there was something beneath it now, something that made the hair stand up on the back of necks throughout the room. "You want proof? Fine. But first you need to understand something." He turned his wrist in Whitmore's grip, not pulling free but rotating it so that the lieutenant commander's own hand was now exposed, vulnerable. These tags you call props, Ezekiel continued. These tags have been through things you have only read about in after-action reports. They have been soaked in blood and sand and salt water. They have been held by dying men who asked me to tell their families they loved them. They have been all I had left when everything else was gone. His eyes locked onto Whitmore's. So before I show you what is under this sleeve, I need you to decide something. Are you ready to apologize if you were wrong? Or are you going to keep holding onto my arm like a man who is afraid of what he might learn? The room held its breath. Whitmore's face had gone pale. His grip on Ezekiel's wrist trembled almost imperceptibly. The moment balanced on the edge of a blade, waiting to fall. Whitmore released the old man's wrist. He did not step back, did not retreat, but his hand fell away as if the skin beneath his fingers had suddenly become too hot to touch. The lieutenant commander's confidence had cracked, just slightly, just enough for doubt to seep through. He covered it quickly with a sneer, with the bravado of a man who had never learned how to be wrong gracefully. "Fine," he said. "Show us. Show us your proof. And when it turns out to be nothing, when it turns out you are exactly what I said you are, you walk out of here and never come back. Deal?" Ezekiel did not respond to the terms. He simply began to roll up his sleeve again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The fabric was stiff with age and grime, resistant, but he worked it up past his wrist, past the point where Whitmore had gripped him, up toward the elbow. The first thing that became visible was scar tissue. Not a single scar, but a constellation of them, a map of violence written across flesh. Puckered entry wounds and ragged exit wounds, and the smooth, shiny patches where skin grafts had been applied decades ago. Shrapnel scars stippled the inside of his forearm like a spray of buckshot frozen in time. A long, curved line ran from wrist to elbow, the remnant of a knife fight that Ezekiel had never spoken about to anyone. The bartender drew in a sharp breath. One of the younger SEALs behind Whitmore muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse. Vance had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the old man's arm, as if he were reading scripture. But the scars were not the revelation. The scars were only the preface. Above them, emerging from beneath the rolled fabric like something rising from deep water, the ink began to show. Dark lines first, faded by time, but still distinct. The outline of shape that every person in that bar recognized immediately. The trident. It was not a small tattoo, not the kind of thing a poser might get on a whim at a strip mall parlor. It was massive, covering most of his inner forearm, rendered in the detailed style of the old-school artists who had worked near the naval bases in the 70s and 80s. The eagle clutched the anchor and the pistol and the trident in its talons, its wings spread wide, every feather distinct. Beneath it, waves crashed against rocks in intricate blue-black lines. Above it, a banner unfurled with words too small to read from a distance. Whitmore stared at the tattoo. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No sound came out, but the trident was not alone. Surrounding it, integrated into the design with the kind of artistry that took hours and hours of painful needlework, were other elements. Coordinates. Not just one set, but several, each rendered in precise military notation. 34.5253 in, 69.1725 35.0869 in, 71.1534 e, 31.6257 in, 65.7101 Dates accompanied each set. August 2001, March 2003, November 1989. The locations of operations that had shaped the course of wars, inscribed permanently in skin. And names, small, careful, running along the lower edge of the design like a memorial wall rendered in miniature. Rodriguez, Petrov, Wallace, Chun, O'Brien, Mackenzie. Mac's name was the last in the row, the freshest of the ink, added sometime in the years after Kiener Province. It stood out slightly from the others, the lines a fraction sharper, the black a shade darker. Vance moved closer, drawn by something stronger than curiosity. His eyes traced the coordinates, his lips moving silently as he worked out the locations in his head. When he reached the third set, the color drained from his face entirely. "That is Kandahar," he whispered. "September 2001. The extraction." The words rippled through the crowd. The extraction. Everyone in the special operations community knew about the extraction. It was legend, a story passed down through generations of operators, studied at training facilities, spoken about in hushed tones. A single operator had gone in alone to pull out a CIA asset when no one else could reach him in time. A single operator had walked through 31 hostiles and walked back out with 2 bullets in him and the asset over his shoulder. No one knew who the operator was. The file was classified beyond classification, locked away in vaults that most admirals did not have clearance to access. The man who had done it had become a ghost, a myth, a standard against which all other acts of valor were measured. Vance looked up from the tattoo to Ezekiel's face. His voice shook when he spoke. "That was you," he said. It was not a question. Ezekiel did not confirm or deny. He simply stood there with his sleeve rolled up and his history exposed to the light, waiting for whatever came next. The bar had gone so quiet that the hum of the refrigeration units behind the bar sounded like thunder. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they were witnessing pressed down on every person in the room like a physical force. Whitmore's face had transformed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He stared at the tattoo, at the scars, at the names of the dead inscribed in flesh. And for the first time in perhaps his entire career, he had absolutely nothing to say. One of the older veterans at the doorway broke the silence. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but it carried through the stillness like a gunshot. "Mother of God," he said. "It is him. It is actually him." Vance turned to face the crowd. His hand trembled as he pointed at Ezekiel. "This man," he said, his voice gaining strength. "This man that you called a fraud. This man that you wanted to throw out into the cold. This man is Senior Chief Ezekiel Carver. Call sign Reaper. And he is the most decorated operator in the history of DevGru." The words fell like hammer blows. Reaper, the name that existed only in whispers. The name that training instructors used to motivate struggling candidates. The name that had become synonymous with everything it meant to be a SEAL. And he was standing in a torn jacket held together with duct tape, homeless for 6 years, being mocked by a man who was not worthy to carry his gear. The silence stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Every eye in the bar was fixed on Ezekiel, on this impossible figure who had materialized out of the cold and the dark like a legend stepping off the page of a classified file. The name Reaper hung in the air, heavy with decades of myth and whispered reverence. Ezekiel could have walked away. The truth was out now. His identity was exposed after 6 years of careful anonymity, 6 years of being no one, of disappearing into the vast, invisible population of the forgotten. He could have rolled his sleeve back down, turned toward the door, and vanished back into the night from which he had come. No one would have stopped him. No one would have dared. But something held him in place. Something in the faces of the men around him, in the way Vance was looking at him, in the weight of Mac's dog tags against his chest. He had spent so long running from who he was that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand still. Whitmore had not moved. The lieutenant commander stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Disbelief, shame, fear, the realization that he had just committed what amounted to career suicide in front of 24 witnesses, that he had mocked and manhandled a living legend, that every word he had spoken in the last hour would follow him for the rest of his service. "Sir," one of the younger SEALs behind him said quietly. "Sir, maybe we should go." Whitmore did not respond. His eyes were locked on Ezekiel's forearm, on the names tattooed there, on the coordinates of operations he had only heard about in briefings delivered by men who spoke in hushed tones. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time in his life, the true cost of the legacy he had inherited, the real price paid by the men who came before him. Ezekiel watched the younger man's face. He could see the fear there, the dawning comprehension of what he had done. A different man might have felt satisfaction. A different man might have pressed his advantage, demanded an apology, humiliated the lieutenant commander the way he himself had been humiliated. But Ezekiel Carver was not that man. He had never been that man. "You did not know," he said quietly. His voice was calm, without accusation or anger. "How could you know? I look exactly like what you said I was. A homeless drunk, a fraud, a man pretending to be something he is not." Whitmore's mouth worked silently. He was trying to form words, trying to find some response that would make this better, but there was nothing. There was no response that could undo what he had done. Ezekiel took a step closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just closing the distance so that only Whitmore could hear what he said next. "I have been called worse, son, by men who meant it, by men who wanted to break me. They did not succeed, and neither did you. So you can stop looking at me like I am about to end your career. That is not why I am here." "Why?" Whitmore managed. His voice was hoarse, cracked. "Why are you here?" Ezekiel considered the question. It was a fair one. He had asked it of himself 1,000 times over the past 6 years. Why did he keep going? Why did he not simply lie down and let the cold take him? Why did he walk miles through the December night to reach a bar he had no business entering, a reunion he had no right to attend? The answer came to him slowly, rising from somewhere deep. "Because they're still here," he said. He touched the dog tags at his chest, both sets, his and Mac's. "Because I carry them with me, and as long as I am breathing, they're not forgotten. Because giving up would mean their sacrifice meant nothing. And I cannot let that happen, not while I am still standing." He looked around the room, at the faces watching him, at the men who had served and the men who were still serving. "I came in from the cold tonight because I was freezing. That is the simple truth. I did not know there was a reunion here. I did not know I would be recognized. I just wanted to sit somewhere warm for a few minutes before I went back out." He paused. "But maybe there is a reason I ended up here. Maybe there is a reason I am standing in front of all of you." Vance stepped forward. His eyes were wet, though he was trying hard not to show it. "Senior Chief," he said, "what happened to you? After you retired, we all thought you were set. The pension, the benefits, the house in Virginia Beach. How did you end up on the streets?" The question cut deeper than any of Whitmore's insults. It went to the heart of everything Ezekiel had been running from. The house in Virginia Beach. The pension he had never collected. The life he had walked away from because living it without Colleen had felt like a betrayal. He did not answer immediately. He looked down at his arm, at the names inscribed there, at the dates that marked the worst moments of his life and the best. Then he rolled his sleeve back down, slowly, carefully, covering the history he had finally allowed the world to see. "There was a woman," he said finally. "My wife. She died 6 years ago. And when she died, I lost the only thing that was keeping me anchored to this world. So I let go. I stopped fighting. I let myself drift." He met Vance's eyes. It was not brave. It was not noble. It was the opposite of everything I ever taught the men who served under me. But grief does not follow the rules we set for it. Grief goes where it wants. And sometimes it takes us to places we never thought we would go. The bar remained silent. The weight of his words settled over everyone like a blanket, heavy and warm and suffocating all at once. Vance wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He had not tried to hide it. "You trained me," he said. "Coronado, 1994. I was the kid who almost drowned on the second day. You pulled me out of the water. You told me that drowning was easy and that living was the hard part." He took a shaky breath. "I never forgot that. I never forgot you." Ezekiel looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, the ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "I remember you," he said. "You were too stubborn to quit. I like that about you." The moment of connection between Ezekiel and Vance broke something open in the room. The tension that had been coiled so tightly began to unwind, replaced by something else entirely. Respect, reverence, the dawning understanding that they were standing in the presence of history. One of the older veterans at the doorway moved first. He was perhaps 65, with a silver beard and the weathered hands of a man who had spent decades working with rope and steel. He walked slowly toward Ezekiel, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. When he reached him, he stopped and stood at attention. "Petty Officer First Class Leonard Whitfield," he said. "Team 4, 1982 to 1996. I heard stories about you when I was just a tadpole at Coronado. They said there was an operator who could disappear in plain sight, who could move through enemy territory like he was made of smoke. They said he had ice water in his veins and fire in his heart. He paused, his voice thickening. They said his call sign was REAPER, and that he was the best who ever wore the trident. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. "It is an honor, Senior Chief." Ezekiel looked at the man, at the salute held steady despite the emotion visible on his face. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had saluted him. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him with anything other than disgust or pity or the blank indifference of those who had learned not to see the homeless. He returned the salute. The motion came back to him automatically, muscle memory that 6 years on the streets had not erased. His hand came up sharp and precise, his posture straightening, his shoulders squaring. For just an instant, the broken old man in the torn jacket disappeared, and in his place stood the operator he had once been. "The honor is mine," he said quietly. Another veteran stepped forward, then another. One by one, men who had served in Vietnam and Panama and the Gulf and Afghanistan and Iraq approached Ezekiel Carver and rendered their salutes. Some of them had tears streaming down their faces. Some of them could barely speak. But all of them stood at attention. All of them showed the respect that had been so brutally denied just minutes before. The younger SEALs watched in stunned silence. They had never seen anything like this. They had grown up in an era of social media and instant celebrity, where operators wrote books and appeared on podcasts and traded on their service for fame and fortune. They had never encountered a man who had done more than all of them combined and wanted nothing, asked for nothing, expected nothing in return. Whitmore remained frozen in place. The lieutenant commander had not moved since Vance identified Ezekiel, had not spoken, had barely breathed. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow. He was watching his career crumble in real time, watching every bridge he had built burn to ashes around him. But more than that, he was watching something he did not understand. He was watching men he respected, men he admired, men whose approval he had spent his entire career seeking, weep openly for a homeless stranger he had tried to throw out into the cold. One of the younger SEALs, a petty officer with 3 deployments under his belt, turned to Whitmore. His expression was difficult to read. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think you need to say something." Whitmore blinked. He looked at the petty officer, then at Ezekiel, then at the line of veterans still waiting to pay their respects. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Vance stepped in. He positioned himself between Whitmore and Ezekiel, his back to the senior chief, his eyes locked on the lieutenant commander. "Listen to me carefully," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "You have approximately 30 seconds to apologize to this man. Not because it will save your career. It will not. Not because anyone here will forget what you did. They will not. But because it is the right thing to do, and somewhere underneath all that arrogance, I have to believe there is still a man who knows the difference between right and wrong." Whitmore swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly in his throat. "I do not know," he said. His voice cracked. "How was I supposed to know?" "That is exactly the point." Vance's tone hardened. "You were not supposed to know. You were supposed to treat him with basic human dignity regardless of who he was. You were supposed to remember that every veteran, every single one, deserves respect until they prove otherwise. Instead, you judged him by his clothes, by his circumstances, by everything except the content of his character." He stepped closer to Whitmore, close enough that the younger man had to look up to meet his eyes. "The trident does not just represent what we can do in combat. It represents who we are as men. It represents integrity and honor and the commitment to something larger than ourselves. Tonight, you forgot that. Tonight, you let your ego make you forget the most basic principles of what it means to wear that symbol on your chest." Whitmore's eyes dropped to the floor. His shoulders sagged. Whatever fight had been in him was gone now, drained away by the weight of his own shame. "You are right," he said. His voice was barely audible. "You are right, Master Chief. I forgot." "Then remember," Vance said, "and go apologize to the man you wronged." Whitmore nodded slowly. He turned toward Ezekiel, who had been watching the exchange in silence. The line of veterans parted to let him through, their eyes following him with a mix of contempt and pity. When he reached Ezekiel, Whitmore stopped. He stood there for a long moment, struggling to find words. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to one knee. "Senior Chief Carver," he said. His voice shook. "I was wrong. I was arrogant and cruel, and everything a SEAL is not supposed to be. I have no excuse. I can only offer my deepest apology and my word that I will spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of the legacy you built." He looked up, meeting Ezekiel's eyes. "I am sorry, sir. Truly sorry." The bar held its breath, waiting to see what the legend would do. Ezekiel looked down at the young lieutenant commander kneeling before him. The bar was silent, every breath held, every eye fixed on this moment that felt like it belonged in a church rather than a veterans hall. The amber lights cast long shadows across the floor, and the photographs on the walls seemed to lean in, the faces of the dead watching to see what the living would do. He could feel Mac's dog tags against his chest. He could feel Colleen's photograph in his pocket, worn soft at the edges from years of being held in the dark. He could feel the weight of every choice he had made since walking out of that house in Virginia Beach, every mile he had walked, every cold night he had endured, every moment he had spent believing he deserved nothing better than what the streets had given him. And now here was this young man, this arrogant young officer who had mocked him and grabbed him and tried to throw him out into the December night, kneeling at his feet and asking for forgiveness. Ezekiel had learned many things in his 71 years. He had learned how to kill silently and efficiently. He had learned how to move through darkness like he was part of it. He had learned how to endure pain that would have broken lesser men, how to compartmentalize horror, how to keep functioning when everything inside him was screaming to stop. But the hardest thing he had ever learned, the thing that had taken him the longest to understand, was that forgiveness was not about the person asking for it. Forgiveness was about the person being asked. He reached down and placed his hand on Whitmore's shoulder. The younger man flinched at the touch, then went still. "Stand up," Ezekiel said quietly. Whitmore rose slowly, his legs unsteady, his eyes wet. He stood at attention before Ezekiel, waiting for judgment. "Look at me, son." Whitmore raised his eyes. In them, Ezekiel could see fear and shame and something else, something that looked almost like hope. The hope of a man who knew he had done wrong and desperately wanted a chance to make it right. "I forgive you," Ezekiel said. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Whitmore's face crumpled. His composure, already fractured, shattered completely. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and he did not try to hide them. "I do not deserve that," he whispered. "No," Ezekiel agreed. "You do not. But forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing. I can choose to carry what you did tonight as another wound, another weight, another reason to believe that the world is cruel and people are worthless. Or I can choose to let it go, to believe that you are capable of being better than you were tonight." He paused, his hand still on Whitmore's shoulder. "I have been carrying enough weight for 6 years. I am tired, so I choose to let this go. Not for you, for me." Whitmore nodded, unable to speak. His throat worked, but no words came out. Ezekiel released his shoulder and took a step back. "But I need you to understand something, Lieutenant Commander. What you did tonight, the way you treated me, that is not about me. It is about every veteran you will ever encounter. Every man or woman who served and came home broken. Every operator who looks like they have nothing left because they gave everything they had." He swept his gaze across the room, taking in all the faces watching him. We do not all come home whole. Some of us come home missing pieces that no one could see. Some of us spend the rest of our lives trying to find those pieces, and some of us never do. You cannot tell by looking at someone what they have been through. You cannot tell by their clothes or their circumstances or the way they smell. So you treat everyone with dignity. Everyone, until they give you a reason not to. He looked back at Whitmore. That is what the trident means. That is what we are supposed to be. Not just the best warriors in the world. The best men. Do you understand? "Yes, sir." Whitmore's voice was hoarse but steady. "I understand. Then learn from tonight. Grow from it. Become the officer you were supposed to be. That is how you make this right. Not with words, with actions, with the rest of your career. The bartender had moved closer during the exchange. He stood just a few feet away, watching Ezekiel with an expression of profound respect. When Ezekiel finished speaking, the bartender stepped forward. "Senior Chief," he said, "I served 4 years in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan. I never made it to special operations, never even came close. But I know what service means, and I know what sacrifice looks like." He swallowed hard. "What you just did, forgiving him like that after everything he said, that is the most impressive thing I have ever seen in this bar. And I have seen a lot." Ezekiel turned to face him. The bartender was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and the subtle tension in his posture that marked men who had seen combat. "What is your name, son?" "Derek, sir." "Derek Caldwell." "Derek." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "You gave me water when I walked in from the cold. You did not have to do that. You did not know who I was. You just saw a man who needed help, and you helped him. It was just water, sir." "No." Ezekiel shook his head. "It was kindness. And kindness is never just anything. It is the thing that separates us from the darkness. It is the thing that makes all the rest of it worth doing." He reached out and gripped Derek's hand firmly. "Thank you for the water. It meant more than you know." Derek's eyes glistened. He nodded, unable to find words. Vance cleared his throat. He had been watching the exchange in silence, but now he stepped forward with purpose in his eyes. "Senior Chief," he said, "I know this is not what you planned for tonight. I know you probably want to go back out there and disappear again. But I am asking you, as someone who owes you his life, to stay. Just for a little while longer. Let's buy you a meal. Let's sit with you. Let's try to give back some small piece of what you gave to all of us." Ezekiel looked at him. The offer hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. For the first time in 6 years, he did not immediately say no. The back room of the Anchor's Rest had been transformed. The reunion that had been in full swing an hour ago had become something else entirely, something quieter and more reverent. Tables had been pushed together to form a long row, and the veterans who had gathered there now sat in silence, waiting. They had given Ezekiel the seat at the head of the table. He had tried to refuse, had insisted that he did not deserve any special treatment, but Vance would not hear of it. "You sat at the head of tables for 30 years, the Master Chief had said. You can sit there one more time." So Ezekiel sat. He felt strange in the chair, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the physical sensation. The room was warm, and the lights were soft, and there was food in front of him, a plate of steak and potatoes that Derek had brought from the kitchen without being asked. It was more food than Ezekiel had seen in months. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. The men around him did not stare. They did not pepper him with questions or demand stories from his legendary career. They simply sat with him, eating their own meals, talking quietly among themselves, creating a space where he could exist without pressure or expectation. It was, he realized, exactly what he needed, exactly what he had not known he needed. Vance sat to his right. The Master Chief had not stopped watching him since the confrontation at the bar, his eyes carrying a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that looked almost like protectiveness. He waited until Ezekiel had taken several bites before speaking. "I'll look for you," he said quietly. "After you retired, I tried to find you. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did at Coronado, for pulling me out of the water, for not giving up on me when everyone else said I should ring out." Ezekiel chewed slowly, swallowed. He did not look up from his plate. "You did not need to thank me. You made it through on your own. I just gave you a push." It was more than a push. Vance leaned closer. "You told me that drowning was easy and living was the hard part. I have thought about those words every single day since. Every time I wanted to quit, every time I thought I could not go on, I heard your voice saying those words. You saved my life, Senior Chief, not just in the water. Every day since." Ezekiel set down his fork. His appetite, so fierce a moment ago, had vanished. He stared at the food on his plate, at the steam rising from the potatoes, at the way the light reflected off the knife beside his hand. "I should not have disappeared," he said finally. His voice was barely audible. "When Colleen died, I should have reached out. I should have let people help me. Instead, I ran. I ran from everyone who cared about me, from every brother I ever served with, from every man who would have stood beside me if I had just asked. He looked up, meeting Vance's eyes. I was ashamed, not of what I had done in service. I was never ashamed of that. I was ashamed of what I had become, of what grief had turned me into. I could not bear the thought of anyone seeing me like this. Vance reached out and gripped his arm. The touch was firm, grounding. There is no shame in grief, he said. There is no shame in breaking. The only shame would be in staying broken when people are reaching out to help you stand back up. The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. He felt something crack inside him, some wall that he had built so carefully over 6 years of solitude and self-punishment. His eyes burned. His throat tightened. For a moment, he thought he might lose control entirely, might break down sobbing in front of all these men who looked at him like he was something more than human. He did not break, not completely, but a single tear escaped, tracing a path down his weathered cheek and disappearing into his beard. I do not know how to come back, he whispered. I have been gone so long. I do not know if there is anything left to come back to. Vance's grip tightened on his arm. Then we will help you find out. That is what brothers do. A voice spoke from further down the table. It belonged to one of the older veterans, a man in his 70s with a Marine Corps tattoo faded on his forearm and eyes that had seen too much. I was homeless for 2 years, the man said. His voice was gravelly, worn by decades of cigarettes and hard living. After my second divorce, after I lost everything, I lived under a bridge in San Diego. I thought I was going to die there. Thought I deserved to die there. He looked directly at Ezekiel. A man from a veterans organization found me, pulled me out, got me into a program. It took time. It took more time than I thought I had. But I am here now. I am alive. And every day I wake up in a bed instead of on concrete. I remember that coming back is possible, no matter how far gone you think you are. Other voices joined in. Stories began to emerge from around the table. Men who had struggled with addiction. Men who had lost marriages and families and fortunes. Men who had stared into the abyss and somehow found their way back. Each story was different, but each carried the same message. You're not alone. You are not beyond saving. There is still time. Ezekiel listened. He listened to men he had never met share their darkest moments, their deepest shames, their hardest-won victories. He listened to the brotherhood that he had thought he had forfeited forever reach out and wrap itself around him like a blanket. And somewhere in the listening, something shifted. The weight on his chest, the weight he had been carrying for 6 years, began to ease. Not disappear, not yet, but ease just enough to let him breathe. When the last story finished, the room fell silent. Every eye turned to Ezekiel, waiting. He looked around the table at these men, these brothers, these survivors. I do not know if I could do this, he said. His voice was stronger now, steadier. I do not know if I have it in me anymore, but I am willing to try. Vance smiled. It was the first genuine smile Ezekiel had seen in longer than he could remember. That is all we ask, Senior Chief. That is all any of us can do. Try. The night had grown late. The crowd in the Anchor's Rest had thinned as men said their goodbyes and drifted home to families and beds and lives that would resume in the morning. But the back room remained occupied. A core group of veterans had stayed, unwilling to leave until they knew what would become of the legend who had wandered in from the cold. Vance had been making phone calls for the past hour. He had stepped away from the table multiple times, his voice low and urgent, his hand gesturing even though the person on the other end could not see him. Now he returned, sliding his phone into his pocket, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. I made some arrangements, he said, taking his seat beside Ezekiel. There's a transitional housing facility about 20 minutes from here. It is run by a woman named Catherine Reyes. She is former Navy herself, served as a corpsman with the Marines in Fallujah. She started the program 5 years ago, specifically for special operations veterans. Ezekiel looked at him, but did not speak. His plate was empty now, cleaned with the thoroughness of a man who had learned never to waste food. It is not a shelter, Vance continued. It is not some government program with 1,000 forms and a 6-month waiting list. It is a house. A real house with real beds. Private rooms. No questions asked about where you have been or what you have done. Just a place to sleep and people who understand. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Catherine has a room available. She is holding it for you. Tonight, if you want it. The offer hung in the air between them. A room, a bed, a roof that did not leak when it rained, walls that held back the wind, a door that could close against the world. Things that Ezekiel had not had in 6 years. Things that most people took for granted. Things that had come to feel like luxuries reserved for a version of himself that no longer existed. I cannot pay, he said quietly. I have not collected my pension in 6 years. I do not even know if it is still there. Vance shook his head. You do not need to pay. The program is funded by donations from the community, from veterans who made it back and want to help others do the same. He leaned forward. And Senior Chief, your pension is still there. I checked. It has been accumulating this whole time. You have more than enough to get back on your feet. Ezekiel absorbed this information slowly. 6 years of pension payments, sitting in an account he had forgotten existed. Money he had walked away from because he had not believed he deserved it. Money that could have kept him warm, could have fed him, could have given him a fighting chance. He had punished himself for Colleen's death by refusing the very things that might have helped him survive it. I was a fool, he said. No. Vance's voice was firm. You were grieving. You were lost. There is a difference. The bartender, Derek, appeared at the edge of the room. He had shed his apron and was wearing a coat, his keys in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. Senior Chief, I know this is not my place. I'm not one of you. I was just Army, just a regular grunt. But I wanted you to know that what happened here tonight changed something in me. The way you forgave that officer, the way you talked about kindness and dignity, I'm not going to forget that. He swallowed hard. If there is ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, you just have to ask. Ezekiel looked at the young man. He saw the sincerity in his eyes, the earnestness of someone who had not yet been hollowed out by the world. It reminded him of Mac. It reminded him of all the young men he had trained over the decades, the ones who had looked at him with that same mixture of respect and hope. You already did something, he said. You gave me water. You treated me like a human being when no one else would. That is not nothing, Derek. That is everything. Derek nodded, his eyes glistening. Then he turned and walked out into the night. Vance stood. It is time, he said. Let me drive you to Catherine's place. You can get a shower, a real bed, a chance to rest. Tomorrow we can start figuring out the rest of it. The pension, the paperwork, whatever else needs to be done. But tonight, you just need to sleep. Ezekiel did not move immediately. He sat at the table, looking at the empty plates and the half-finished drinks and the photographs on the walls. He thought about Colleen. He thought about Mac. He thought about all the years he had spent running from the pain, only to find that the pain had been running alongside him the entire time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he had carried for 6 years. Colleen's face smiled up at him, frozen in a moment of joy that he could barely remember. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, feeling the softness where the paper had worn thin. I'm going to try, he whispered to her. I do not know if I can make it, but I'm going to try. Then he slipped the photograph back into his pocket, pushed himself to his feet, and turned to face Vance. All right, he said. Let us go. Vance smiled. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He simply walked beside Ezekiel as they made their way through the bar, past the photographs of fallen heroes and the challenge coins on the counter and the flags that hung by the door. Outside, the December air was bitter and sharp. But Ezekiel did not feel the cold way he had when he walked in hours ago. Something had changed. Something had shifted in the architecture of his soul. He was not healed. He knew that. The road ahead would be long and hard and filled with moments when he would want to give up, moments when the grief would crash over him like a wave and threaten to pull him back under. But for the first time in 6 years, he believed that he might survive those moments. He believed that there might be something worth surviving for. Vance's truck was parked across the street. They walked toward it together, two men who had been shaped by the same crucible, bound by the same oath, carried by the same brotherhood that had defined their lives. The night was dark, but ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, the first light of dawn was beginning to gather. 3 months later, the spring sun was warm on Ezekiel's face as he stood outside the transitional housing facility that had become his home. The trees along the street had begun to bud, pale green shoots pushing through the gray of winter, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing the kind of song that he had forgotten existed during his years on the streets. He looked different now. His beard was trimmed close, neat and silver against his weathered skin. His clothes fit properly, purchased with pension money that had finally been accessed and put to use. He had gained weight, not much, but enough that his frame no longer looked skeletal beneath his jacket. His eyes, though still carrying the depth of everything he had seen and done, had lost some of their haunted quality. There was light in them again, faint, fragile, but present. Catherine Reyes stood beside him on the porch. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and the quiet competence of someone who had spent her life in service to others. She had not pushed him. She had not demanded that he talk about his past or attend therapy sessions or follow any particular path to recovery. She had simply given him space, given him time, given him the one thing he had denied himself for 6 years, permission to heal. "You have a visitor," she said, nodding toward the truck pulling into the driveway. Vance climbed out and walked toward them with a manila folder tucked under his arm. He had become a regular presence in Ezekiel's life over the past months, stopping by every week to check in, to share a meal, to sit in comfortable silence when words were not needed. The bond that had been forged at Coronado decades ago had been renewed, strengthened by the shared understanding of men who had walked through fire and come out the other side. "Got something for you," Vance said as he reached the porch. He handed the folder to Ezekiel. "It arrived yesterday. I thought you would want to see it in person." Ezekiel opened the folder. Inside was a letter on official Navy stationery, dense with formal language and bureaucratic precision. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed each sentence. It was a commendation, a formal recognition of his lifetime of service, signed by the current commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command. The letter acknowledged operations that had never been publicly disclosed, contributions that had shaped the course of conflicts most Americans did not know had happened. It concluded with an invitation to attend a ceremony at Coronado, where he would be honored in front of the current generation of operators. His hands trembled as he held the paper. "I do not need this," he said quietly. "I never did any of it for recognition." "I know," Vance replied, "but they need to give it. The young ones need to see you. They need to understand that the legacy they inherited came from men like you. Men who gave everything and asked for nothing in return." Ezekiel stared at the letter for a long moment. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back into the folder. "I will think about it," he said. Catherine smiled. "That is progress. 3 months ago you would have said no without hesitation." She was right. 3 months ago he would have refused anything that brought attention to himself, anything that required him to stand in front of others and be seen. But something had changed in him during his time at the facility. The walls he had built so carefully had begun to come down, brick by brick, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. "There is something else," Vance said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I had this made for you. It is not official. It is not from the Navy. It is from the brothers. From all of us who served with you, or because of you." Ezekiel opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a challenge coin unlike any he had ever seen. It was heavy, solid bronze, with the DevGru insignia on one side. On the other was engraved a single word, REAPER. Beneath it, in smaller letters, still standing. Vance's voice was thick when he spoke. "We had 100 of them made. They have been distributed to operators all over the world. When they look at that coin, they will remember that no matter how far you fall, you can always stand back up. That is your legacy now, Senior Chief. Not the kills, not the operations, the standing back up." Ezekiel closed his fingers around the coin. He could feel the weight of it, the substance, the meaning that had been poured into every line of its design. For a moment, he could not speak. The emotion that rose in his chest was too large for words. "Thank you," he finally managed. His voice cracked. "Thank you, brother." Vance gripped his shoulder. "Welcome home, Reaper." They stood together in the spring sunlight, 3 people bound by service and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Behind them, the house that had given Ezekiel shelter waited with its doors open. Ahead, the future stretched out uncertain but no longer terrifying. That evening, after Vance had gone and Catherine had retired to her office, Ezekiel sat alone on the porch with the challenge coin in one hand and Colleen's photograph in the other. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the bird was still singing somewhere in the trees. He looked at Colleen's face, at the smile that had saved him more times than any weapon ever had. "I am still here," he whispered to her. "I'm still trying, and I think maybe I'm going to make it." He pressed the photograph to his chest, feeling her presence as surely as if she were sitting beside him. Then he looked up at the sky, at the first stars beginning to appear in the gathering dusk, and he allowed himself to believe that somewhere, somehow, she was watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to this channel. Right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching. The coin was warm in his palm. The photograph was soft against his heart. And Senior Chief Ezekiel Carver, callsign Reaper, the most decorated operator in DevGru history, sat on the porch of his new home and watched the night arrive, no longer afraid of the dark.